Welcome to Waterside Chat. Tom Sadler talks with guests who depend on healthy oceans and fisheries for their recreation and livelihoods. And now, let's get started.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Waterside Chat. I'm your host, Tom Sadler with the Marine Fish Conservation Network. I am delighted to be joined by my close friend, good friend, and old former colleague, Kris Millgate. Kris is the Emmy Award-winning multimedia journalist who started Tightline Media back in 2006. We're coming up on a milestone there. She hosted Time Out, an outdoor news program, for 7 years, then created a magazine, Outdoor Magazine, in 2014. But that didn't stop there. Her first book, My Place Among Men, was published in 2019. The sequel, My Place Among Fish, there's a trend here, was published in 2001, along with, and again, no moss growing on her rock, a debut of her Salmon film, which we wrote about in the network's blog, Ocean to Idaho. Her third book, My Place Among Beasts. I think we have a trend here, published with her a film to go with that, on grizzly ground. We're going to talk about her books, her films, and get a behind-the-scene look at how she searches out her topics and makes them compelling in her video stories. And she's going to also give us a little preview of her latest production, breaking a trend here, Sage Wisdom West. So Kris never does anything halfway, and I am delighted to have her on the show today. Welcome, Kris.
Hello. Thank you, Tom. It's fun to see your face and to join all of you on this call.
Well, I wish we could do this in person, but, the logistics of being you in Idaho and me in Virginia, just we're blessed with the magic of Zoom, of Zoom. So in the intro, I talked a little bit about some of your credentials, but there's a lot more to those stories. So let's start with My Place Among Men. Give me the backstory. Why did you write that?
What started happening over my career as a journalist is I started to do what you'd call niche, right? I started to navigate toward outdoor and environment stories. And I was a general assignment lead live reporter for a decade for TV news, for every network but CBS. That's just how things shook out. But I would always go after those stories that were outside, that had to do with what was happening in the wild. And I would figure out how to make those the lead live story, because at the time there wasn't an outdoor beat. But at the same time as I was going after these outdoor stories that I knew one day would be the top of the show, as they are today, people started realizing that I was doing some pretty unusual coverage. I was covering things that not only nobody was covering, like wildfire. We really weren't, it wasn't on radar 3 decades ago. And, but also that I was doing it as a woman. That was unusual. So I had a beat that didn't exist, and I was a minority. The industry that I work in is male dominated, and outdoor stories, those are no place for a lady. And so people would start to say, well, what's it like to do your job? And at the time, all I was thinking was, I don't even know what you're asking me. And they would say, well, you're the only woman on the crew a lot of times. What's that like? Well, it just means that I'm the only one without facial hair. I don't think about the gender, and I would just do my job. We're all there to do our job. I carry my weight and I do my job well. That's what mattered. But people kept asking, no, what's it really like to be the lone woman in the woods? And then that's when I realized that there was a story there that I wasn't paying attention to, but that everybody else was paying attention to. And that's something you have to do as you're trying to figure out what to cover and what stories to tell. What are people asking you about? And people were asking me about what it's like to do my job as a woman. So I took 20 years of the best outdoor and environment stories that I'd covered, and I turned them into chapters. And then I added the perspective of I. There is no I in news. When I cover a news story, it's not about what I think. But in a book, you can put I in a book. And that's how the first book developed, was off of that.
That's That's groundbreaking, right? I mean, it was obviously you and I have talked about the book offline, and there's um there was some interesting threads in there. You mentioned you were the only one on the crew without facial hair that came out in there. But what are some of your highlights? If you, for someone who has not read the book, what would you offer up as um, enticements, appetizers to the book, and say, here's an interesting thing that I wrote about that you might not expect to see?
I know what you're asking me, and that's to give you like direct outdoor issues that I've covered, and we can go
Right.
there.
Right.
Wildfires, water wars, reintroduction of wolves, disappearing fish, going nose to nose with a grizzly bear. I'm going to tell you right now, if that ever happens to you, you will pee your pants. There's no
Yeah.
way around that. Those
Yeah.
are the kind of details that go
You'll
in the
be
book.
lucky if you just pee your pants.
I know that was all. That was all I did. So I was like, well, that could be worse.
Right?
So those kind of details are in there. You know what it's really like to work outside. But I find that the thing that people most attach to when they read that book is two very personal elements. And I think they're attaching to those elements because it makes me human, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a superhero. I'm just a girl trying to cover a story outside that I think is important that you need to know about. And the two things are this. First, I grew up painfully shy. So shy I couldn't look you in the eye. I didn't want to make eye contact. Conversations were out of the question. But I studied people when they didn't think I was looking. So I'm a kind of a covert master of human behavior because of that. And I think that comes through in the way I tell stories. That shyness seems to be something that people really connect with. There's a lot of that out there. I wasn't born with the skill set to be a journalist, but I knew that was what I was going to do, regardless of how many people said I couldn't do it. So I had to learn how to get over that. That resonates with people. And the other thing that people find surprising that they connect to in an interesting way is that not only was I painfully shy, I was terrified of beards. And so anybody that had facial hair, it was not happening. I wasn't going to do it. And now I talk to strangers every day and I run around in the woods with beards all the time. So it shows that even if you're not born with a skill set to do something, if you really want to do it, you will figure out how to push through all those things that are uncomfortable and find a way to sit with what's uncomfortable. It's different than what's unsafe. But if you can learn to sit with what's uncomfortable, the sky's the limit at that point.
That's a great point. Being not un it's being uncomfortable but not unsafe. I mean, that's a important element for any of us who spend time in the outdoors. Courage is not foolish disregard for danger. It's being comfortable with pressing on and pressing yourself. So um it's um it's a remarkable story. Um the question I guess I was going to ask was, are you happy you wrote the book?
I will tell you this. When I write a story, any story, these little chunks of me go with that story.
Mm-hmm.
So I would never want to write something that I'm going to regret. I only know how to write the truth. And sometimes the truth is painful. And I just recorded my books as audiobooks, which meant
Uh-huh.
I had to put my voice to what I write. And that's pretty eye-opening when you realize some of the things you write that were really painful to put on the page because personally there's a struggle there or there's a confrontation there with a beard that maybe you don't want people to know about, but it's the truth. So it goes in these books and then you decide to take a paperback and make it an audiobook and you add voice to those lines. You have to own what you say all the way through, regardless of the uh, discomfort that you may feel. If it's honest, you own it. So I'm
Sure.
glad the book's out. And I like that. And I'm proud of that book. And I'm proud of all of the work I put out. And if I'm not proud of it, I should not be putting it out.
No, as my friend, I'm extremely proud of you for doing that book. Was it really hard to read it out loud?
Um, It comes and goes. There are certain chapters in my books that I found really hard to read out loud. Like I need to stop recording and gather myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not fabricated. That's not dramatized for the sake of the
Right, right.
recording. That's just how personal some of the writing is, especially as you get into the books that followed that first book. But all along the way, I would know. I mean, I wrote them, so I knew what chapter was coming, and I was like, okay, today's the day I got to voice that chapter. Pull
Right.
yourself together. You got to give a little pep talk. But I think it made a difference in the fact that I wrote the words, and I was going to read the words out loud to you, and I knew what I meant when I wrote those words, and that feeling comes through when I voice those words.
Awesome. Well, I we could spend the whole time talking about the book because of how groundbreaking it was, and I encourage anyone who's listening to this, watching this, that if you had to pick between any of her children, her book children, that would be the one that I would recommend the most, and for you to start with. And then I think it will lead you, like this conversation will lead you into her next book. Since we are the Marine Fish Conservation Network, we will have to talk a little bit more about fish.
Yes.
You took your bravery on the road, if you will. And there was something that I caught when I was putting together the blog article a while back. It's almost 2 years now. You wrote, "Migrating salmon take a beating coming home, and so did I. Broken cameras, bruises, stitches, and skin cancer. I wasn't expecting any of that. I was worn out as the fish by the time we made it to mile 850, but we did indeed make it." So that's a foundation, at least in my mind, of both the film and the book. So give us an overview of the book, right? Tell us sort of the journey there, and
Okay.
if you can, because you are a unique individual when you're in your Toyota truck in camper out there on the road. Give us some of the logistics. I think um, it is an interesting part of the film is not just what the topic was, but the logistics of catching that fish, if you will. How'd you like that for working?
Whoa. Okay. So the film about salmon migration is called Ocean to Idaho, and it follows the migration route of Chinook salmon from the coast of Oregon to the wilderness of Idaho. It's an 850-mile swim. The backstory of that migration route is in a book called My Place Among Fish. That sets up what we're going to talk about here.
Right.
Now you have to put yourself back in that horrendous place we were all in back in 2020, which was isolated at home during the pandemic. As a journalist who needs to speak with people, usually in person, face to face, to do their job, being isolated at home was quite shocking. And it meant that every outlet I worked for tanked. If you didn't cover the pandemic, they didn't want your assignment. And if they weren't covering the pandemic, they weren't even open for business. So I had no one to work for. And as a freelance journalist, the way I feed my family is by working for multiple media outlets, covering stories in all types of formats so that I can make a living. That all went away. And so I had to figure out a way, as we were stuck in these desperate times, I came up with some creative measures to do my job. I had thought about following salmon migration for several years. It was kind of like my bucket list. I wanted to see what these fish go through to go home. I have never caught a salmon in Idaho. I have never touched a salmon in Idaho, but I know that they should be here, and I want to see what they go through to get home. So there's a local Toyota dealer that I work with in Idaho a lot, Teton Toyota, and my truck went in for service, and he said, he's always asking me what I was on because I was on the road a lot, so my air filters were always dirty. And during the pandemic, he said, "What in the world are you doing?" And I said, I'm not doing anything. I don't have any work, and I've got to figure something out. And he said, "Well, what were you doing before this started?" And I said, I was planning on following salmon migration. And he said, let's do it. So it was like this whole thing just came together quickly. Toyota brought in a Tundra that had a longer bed than the Tundra I own. And it came into Idaho Falls, brand new. And they wrapped it in a wrap that looked like salmon. And then Four Wheel Camper shipped in a camper because somebody from Europe could not come to America during the pandemic to use it for the summer. It was brand new. That got put on top of the truck, fit in that longer bed. And I lived and worked solo out of a truck and camper the whole summer following the migration route. And it was really surreal to be on the road during the pandemic. First off, some people were kind of pissed. You know, when an Idaho license plate shows up in Oregon, they're flipping you
Yeah.
the bird because you've left your quarantine, right? They weren't really ready for me. And I had to have approval from like the Army Corps of Engineers to enter any of the dams. These salmon go through 8 major dams to get from the ocean to Idaho. They were all shut down. Even the exits to those areas were closed in Oregon. And so it was the first time I'd ever been to the Oregon coast. And it was eye-opening because I had the whole place to myself. It was creepy. There was nobody on the beach. Nobody ever screwed up any of my shots because nobody was around. Nobody was out. So I start following these fish and I think, you know what? This will be cool. I'm gonna do these updates on social media. Everybody's at home. They want to know what's going on out in the world. I'm gonna show them.
Right.
So I start doing these updates and showing people what the migration route's like. And then I realize they're kind of curious about what it's like for me. Like, I'm by myself in this camper. How's life in that? I didn't talk to anybody unless I was interviewing them. We stayed 6 feet apart. I wore masks. We sanitized everything. The only time I saw people outside of interviews was when I filled up my tank at the gas station. I had all my food. I had everything I needed to survive with me. And then things started kind of falling apart, which was uncomfortable because salmon fall apart on the way home. They're on their deathbed when they get back to their crib where they're born in Idaho. They just want to get back here and lay eggs where they were born so they can die. So by the time they get here, they look a lot different than they did at the ocean. And by the time I got to the finish line, I looked a lot different. And that was shocking. That was unexpected. I had a windstorm about mile 400 of 800 that dropped my camera off its tripod and busted it in 3 places. There's no new cameras getting shipped to America from China during a pandemic. I had to duct tape all the pieces together, and I shot about half of this film with a broken camera. And then I had a scab on my ear that wouldn't heal, and that turned into skin cancer. So I lost part of my left ear. It had to be rebuilt. Part of the migration route you can only see by raft. And this is a magical moment. Everybody that had drawn, it's a lottery. You have to draw a permit to raft the Frank Church River of No Return. And that's the Salmon River Wilderness in Idaho. And we hardly ever draw in Idaho. But because nobody could come to Idaho, everybody that had drawn had to give up their permits. So we got a permit. And during that migration route, I floated a stretch of the salmon migration route by living on a raft for a week. And I was actually with my family for that. So there was injuries on that. By the time I got to the finish line, I did have stitches in 4 places and a camera held together with duct tape. And I stood on that bank and I watched these few fish come home and they looked just as bad as I did. And I realized then that people were really intrigued with the creepiness of what was happening to me. They could see it. I mean, when your ears taped up like this on camera, people notice.
Yeah.
You have to address that so you can tell them what the story is really about. And I was really concerned about the whole point of the project was to show people salmon migration. And I did not want to take away from that just because of my own fall apart.
Right.
And so what I decided to do was make the film Ocean to Idaho all about salmon. And then everything that happened behind the camera to me ended up in the book, My Place Among Fish. So as I was editing the film, every few hours I would stop editing and I would write a few chapters. And I did it in tandem, which seems crazy, but because the topic was similar, I could do them both at the same time. And it was in a pretty efficient way to work it so that when the film premiered in 2021, so did the book.
Awesome. Awesome. So, what was during the filming, what what were a couple of the things that about the salmon that you didn't expect, that were like, wow, that, or the attitudes of people along the route? Right? What were some of the, like, I don't necessarily mean highlights, but sort of the, geez, that's not what I expected. Now, recognizing you're in a dystopian time in our nation's history and you're watching a healthy, robust fish in the ocean turn into a zombie, if you will, by the time it gets to, what's the name of the creek? Yankee Creek?
The Yankee Fork of the
Or,
Salmon River.
yeah, Yankee Fork of the Salmon River. So, what were a couple of the aha moments for the fish? For you looking at the fish?
Looking at the fish. Okay, from the fish's perspective, there's a couple, and then there's a couple of aha moments from the humans.
Okay.
So for fish, when you do a project when I do a project like this, it's a full embed. Like I'm all in, and I want to be fully invested in this project. It matters that much to me. And so I actually had to learn how to swim with my head under the water. I don't like my head under the water. And I took swim lessons, and I got up to 20 laps learning how to swim with my head under the water the day before the city pool closed because of the pandemic. And it wasn't that I necessarily needed to be deep in the water. I don't. In fact, some of my best underwater footage comes in very shallow water where my head isn't in the water.
Right.
But it was important for me to understand what the world looks like underwater, because I was about to spend the summer focusing on an animal that spends its whole life underwater. And by learning how to swim with my head under the water, I learned to appreciate the sounds of life under the water. And so one of the things I did on the migration route, when I got to the end of it, I went back to every place I shot footage, and I collected exactly what the water sounded like underneath for the fish.
Ah, cool.
So you could say, here's what it sounds like when fish swim from the ocean to Idaho. We're in the way, dams are in the way, predators are in the way, but this is what the water sounds like that they have to live in. And I made it so you could hear the distinct differences between what it sounds like at a dam versus what it sounds like in wilderness versus what it sounds like at the ocean. And that was surprising to me. I'd never thought about what things sound like underwater, and an animal that lives underwater, that's all they hear.
Right.
So
Right.
that was from the fish's side. Another thing about fish is at the end of the migration route, it's a pretty humbling moment, right?
Sure.
I'm in my waders and I'm all stitched up and my camera's covered in duct tape and I'm ready to go and I'm pacing the banks and I have to be careful because I have stitches in a lot of places and I shouldn't be out, but I want to see these fish finish. And when I finally find a red where the salmon lay their eggs and there's a salmon still alive on it, they don't live very long after they lay eggs, but there was one still alive. I thought I would just instantly start rolling, but I didn't. I stopped and I watched for a long time. That you have to recognize the miracle of that, like 850 miles. This one fish did it. Like, that's amazing to me. And you have to stop and appreciate the magnificence of the wild right then. And then I switched into doing my job. But I gave it the respect that it really needed at that moment. And that was forced by the fish. That wasn't my intention, but it was clear to me that's what needed to happen first. And the water's so shallow when they get to where they want to lay eggs that her back's out of the water and she's exposed to any bird that wants to peck at her back. Her nose is rubbed bare, her fins are threadbare, and you're seeing this unbelievable moment. And as a human, you have to recognize that moment before I go into reporter mode.
Yeah.
On the human side, the most shocking thing I think that I saw was even during the pandemic, the fishing season in Oregon really shocked me. First, because they even have one. We don't fish for wild salmon in Idaho.
Right.
And we don't touch them. And that's because the farther they have to swim, the less make it. So there can still be a season in Oregon. It might be shorter, but at least they have one where we don't even most of the time have a season in Idaho to fish for salmon. And they were, even during the pandemic, Anglers were shoulder to shoulder on the Columbia River system fishing for salmon. I'd never seen anything like that for
Wow.
salmon. And so that was new. And then when you got into central Idaho, in Salmon, Idaho, named after the so said fish, I was driving down the highway and I passed this power pole. I thought, well, that's not right. There's no power lines through here. I stopped and I got out, and you know what it was? It was not just a power pole, it was art. It was all the angst that people feel. The farther you get from the ocean, the more angst people feel about salmon. When you interview people in Idaho, they cry when they talk about salmon. They don't cry in Oregon. They care in Oregon. But in Idaho, the angst is more severe. And it was demonstrated at this power pole. And what the power pole was just a big piece of wood in the shape of a cross with a piece of metal structure nailed onto it in the shape of a salmon with beads running out that were the color red like their eggs. And there were power lines on it, and it was symbolizing salmon sacrificed for hydropower.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Still a hot issue out there, hydropower.
Absolutely.
You treated that very well in the film. Talk a little bit about the issue, the hydropower issue, because that seems to be, it's remove the Snake River dams, right? And so you treated it well. Talk a little bit about that.
Okay, when you want to deal with a decisive issue or a dividing issue, dam removal is a hot button issue. And I realized quickly that nobody wants to lose salmon. Everyone wants to save salmon. That is not what everyone argues over. What people argue over is how to save salmon.
Right.
The Columbia River system was changed dramatically when these dams went in 100 years ago. If these dams ever come out, it will dramatically change the whole West again. That's the reality of it. Yep, fish numbers are shrinking, but you know what shrinks when we take away the dams. And so it's really important on these hot button issues where people butt their heads. I want this story. I want this point where people are butting heads. But I also want to make sure that when I reach this point, I have everybody's point of view. It's not about what I think. It's about what everybody else thinks that makes their livelihood off this system. You take out a dam, you're changing river transportation, you're changing recreation, you're changing irrigation. You're changing power supply. You're changing a lot of things when you take a dam out in the hopes that it will bring a fish back. And so as much as people want these dams out, you also have to recognize that asking a farmer to give up their livelihood for a fish is a big ask. And so those things have to come through in this story. And I want to make sure you hear from every side and then go ahead and decide where you are on the issue. But make sure you understand where everyone's coming from and why this isn't a black and white issue. This is how we powered the West. This is how we developed the West. Even the Yankee Fork of the Salmon River, where these fish are trying to get back to, 3,000 used to make it back to the Yankee Fork historically. 3,000 fish every year could swim 850 miles and make it clear back to this teeny tiny tributary to the Salmon River. The Yankee Fork has been mined and logged and dredged. The Yankee Fork is turned upside down and inside out for gold. And it still looks like that 70 years later. And that restoration work's going on while these fish are still trying to come home. So we've done a lot more than just dams to our watersheds. And we've done them to watersheds, not just in the West, also in the East, across the whole country.
Sure.
Those kind of changes have significant ramifications when you start saying, hey, how about we undo some things we did that maybe we shouldn't have?
So you just made a point, and so I might jump around a little bit here, because I want to come to going from wet to dry, from fish to grizzlies, but I'm struck here, Kris, that because I'm familiar with the film and how you approach this and how you just explained it. But in terms of how we do advocacy, we the network, we the conservation community, if you will, it's difficult to put other people in the scene, if you will. So talk a little bit about how multimedia work you do um, helps tell a story, make advocacy something more than just you know, banging on a door type thing. Do you understand where I'm going with this?
Absolutely, I understand.
Okay.
So what you mean is, how do we get beyond preaching to the choir?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that is a very hard thing to do. But I think it's a very, very important thing to do. And maybe I think that because I'm a journalist, but part of my job is to appeal to an audience in a way that makes them take some time to watch and read and listen. If I can appeal to them with a story in a way that engages them, then they will learn something, and then that leads to action. So I've got to help educate, and then that inspires the activity. One thing that I have to watch for, even if I'm not taking a side, is the fact that a lot of times I too can preach to the choir, because I will be talking to hunters, fishers, hikers, bikers. I'll be talking to the outdoor world, right?
Right.
But we need to engage more than the outdoor world. So you have to find things that meet people at their level. Perfect example is the salmon issue. This debate about removing dams to save salmon has gone on for decades, and there's progress, but yet the dams haven't moved. So
Right.
the discussions continue, and so do the fights. But I think you can tell that there's been a shift in priorities. 100 years ago, it was, what do we get out of the land? We mine it, we log it, we drill it, we develop it. That's what we did.
Right.
Understanding that's where we came from helps us understand how we've ended up where we are today. So that history component's important. All those things are going to continue. But today, you know what? Natural resources have a seat at the table. That's huge. That hasn't always been the case. Now it's about, what do we get by leaving the land as it is? So use that to your benefit. That value matters to people now. And it didn't maybe 100 years ago, not in the way it does today.
Well,
So you have to keep what's important in mind, but then meet everyone where they're at. On salmon, some people come to me and say, I want the dams out. How do I start? What do I need to do? Someone else comes to me and says, I'm not going to throw my gum wrapper in the river anymore because I just realized fish are in there.
mm-hmm.
People come to an issue in all different levels, and you have to meet them where they're at in order to help them connect.
So one of the things that internally, the network here, we talk about storytelling. You met Joe in the green room. You met Colin in the green room. We talked a little bit about how our work to help people become storytellers. Um, Obviously, as a journalist, you have the skill set to do it. Um, but from you in one of the things you said, you went at what you were doing with a journalist eye in terms of, and I don't want to make this sound like it's, pejorative, but you didn't kind of both sides stuff. You told the truth, right? So is in terms of using storytelling in advocacy, are there, besides just telling the truth, are there some other elements that you feel like, hey, these are the things that if you're going to use this tool, this multimedia communications approach, these are the things that you need to keep front of mind, hold hard on. Do you know what I'm asking?
I do. I understand what you're asking. So take the journalist side out of it. You
Hmm.
obviously, if you're advocating, you have a side.
Sure, of
And in
course.
a way, I'm an advocate.
Right.
I'm nature's ambassador, right? Like, clearly I want fish.
Sure.
Uh, I'm not going to hide that. But I'm never going to tell you as a journalist whether or not the dam should stay or go. That's for
Right.
everyone else to decide. I'm here to deliver the information so you can decide. So if you take that element out and you think about it's coming as advocacy, sometimes what I'm doing is just trying to get people to pay attention to what's going on outside. That matters too. You're trying to pay your bills and feed your kids and get to work. I mean, the last thing you're thinking about is what salmon are doing right under your feet trying to swim through town.
Right.
So sometimes what I'm after there is just helping people raise their awareness enough that they want to connect. I love to say, you know what? Maybe you're not going to save salmon. Just stick your feet in a creek. So what I'm saying there is go simple. Think about it's a simple way to make people connect. You have to make them connect before they'll engage. You got to get people to stick their feet in the creek. And
Oh, I love that.
I think what's happened, and especially in recent years, it's even changed the way I work. When I was in the newsroom, if someone didn't like the story I was doing, they would call the news desk. They'd say, I need to talk to Kris Millgate. I got to tell her I don't like the way she did that story. Well, if they didn't like the way I did it, I probably did it right, because usually that's the case. And the news desk would decide if they patched him to me, or if I was on a live shot, they'd say, she's not coming to the phone right now. I'll leave a message. What I'm saying is that it was hard to get to me, right? Social media has changed that for everyone, not just me. People can get to people. They want to access the people relaying the information, and they expect to be able to access those people. That means I have to be accessible. That means they want more personal stuff. I would have never wrote backstories on what I do in the field unless people hadn't started asking for it. And they started asking for it because social media is a more intimate connection.
That's
so
interesting.
Not only do you have to figure out how to connect at their level, maybe your advocacy has to come with a more personal angle. And sometimes maybe that can't happen because you're working on an issue that you're not really personally connected to. But I find when I do my work, if I have a personal investment in the issue that I'm covering, it makes the story that much more powerful. People come to me at my film screenings and they say, here's what you should do next. I've got a great idea for what you should do next. I guarantee you my list of what to do next is really long. Yeah. And I add everyone that these people tell me to add to it. But if it's an issue that I'm not quite connected to, I'm going to hesitate to go after it because it is such a commitment on me mentally, physically, financially, and professionally that I better be all in if I'm going to cover it. And so the same thing has to go with what you're trying to advocate for. You've got to go all in after the message.
But you've helped us understand that something other than just sending a letter to your congressman is that if you get and can engage in the story and tell the story, that's useful. Is that a fair characterization?
That's true. And you want to come at it in different ways. People have a million options for getting their information these days, and they'll check out easy if you're not engaging, and they might not even be on the platform you're trying to engage them with. I had dinner with a gentleman last night who has already listened to all 3 of my audiobooks in the My Place collection. And this is what I loved about the discussion. He wanted to understand the process of how audiobooks are made. But more than that, he read My Place Among Men while hunting caribou in Alaska. And he read it as a paperback. And he really keyed in on raising kids. At the time, his kids were younger. He was raising kids. His kids are teenagers now. He finished the audiobooks last weekend. So we're talking 5 years later. And he said the audiobook experience was totally different than reading the book. And then he got totally different information out of it. He got that perspective of being in the field. And it was like, he said to him, reading the paperback and then listening to the audiobook was like reading 2 different novels.
Really?
And that's case in point. People engage in different ways across different mediums, which is why I am multimedia. I want to reach you where you're at. And if it's audiobooks, that's where we go. And that's the perfect example of why. It's a different experience and people want to access their information through the experience they choose.
Well, that's why we have you on the show. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we have this tool here. So, all right. So we're going to go from the wet to the dry. I'm being conscious of the time here. But let's talk real quickly about on grizzly ground. Grizzly bears, as you said, you come nose to nose with one of those, you're going to be lucky if the only thing you do is pee your pants. So why grizzlies? And what got you interested into it? It was you didn't learn your lesson, or you loved your lesson so much from road tripping. How did you do on grizzly ground? And I see you've got the poster, which is terrific, over your shoulder.
That is actually a handmade quilt. My
Really?
mother-in-law made that, and it's like a million different patches of material. The swatches all come together to make that. And that
Wow.
was in the lobby at the premiere.
Awesome.
Yeah, she's very talented. I don't sew. I can cut the hell out of video and audio, but I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, well, that's remarkable.
So I
All right,
will
so
let her know. So
tell us the story.
the Ocean to Idaho and On Grizzly Ground are their beginnings are actually chapters in My Place Among Men.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go through that book, you can kind of go, oh, I bet she might do this next, you know?
Yeah.
But then the
Yeah.
other part of that was you come off of following salmon migration solo during the pandemic. You have stitches in 4 places and a camera held together with duct tape. The pressure's pretty huge. People want to know what's next before you even know what's next.
Right.
And so I was really nervous during the film tour for Ocean to Idaho because every question and answer session was, what's next? What's next? And I had a couple of ideas, but I could feel that it had to be significant. It's hard to top salmon. It's pretty epic journey, right?
Yeah.
Across the West. And so I also wanted a connection to Idaho where I'm based. And
Right.
it makes sense to be based here because there's so much outdoor access and wildlife. And I had covered grizzly bears multiple times. I've embedded with the trapping team that puts collars on them when they're asleep, which is why I was nose to nose with one when it woke up and I still survived because he was on
Yeah.
drugs. And so there was all these little things that were pointing to this. And I have my source well runs deep after all these decades. And so I contacted some sources and my favorite wildlife biologist threw it out. He said, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I know what we're risking and it's you. Well, I'm not going to say, okay, I'm not giving the green light. And I said, well, you don't necessarily have to give me the green light to do my job as a journalist. It'd be great if you did. And so we went back and forth, but basically what it came down to was I can follow grizzly bears for the summer without losing my life because I don't need to see a grizzly bear every day.
Right.
And there are times when I do need to see him and get that footage, but I also have rules I'm going to follow about how I'm going to proceed in these situations. And that would reduce the risk factor a little bit, but I was really chasing something that could kill me. And that's a different dynamic than when you're following fish.
Right.
So, but it was important to do it. And I never looked back as soon as we started on it. And I wasn't necessarily intending to do another book. And I wasn't necessarily intending to do a book for fish, but if the opportunity presents itself, I'll go for it. And the backstory came through on beasts pretty early. And that's how everything came together. Grab a drink.
Yeah.
So I had a danger element on grizzlies for sure that I wasn't in fish.
Yes. Well, yeah, for sure. And it's the grizzly is a American icon. It can be the thing of nightmares. And what was sort of, again, I'm going to cut back to so what were the revelations that you got out of it? A la like the salmon. What from the animal? One from the animal, one from Kris.
On grizzly bears, the issue's different. On fish, we're talking about an animal that's disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
You can't debate that. The populations dwindled to piddly numbers on salmon. Overall, when you look at, even if there's a good year, if you look at historical trends, it's down.
Oh, for sure.
The cool thing about grizzly bears is they're not down. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, they've gone from less than 200 in the 80s to more than 1,000 today.
Mm-hmm.
That's a significant improvement. So we were kind of on a high note, right? We're talking about a recovered animal.
Mm-hmm.
But the angst is this. They're on the list, they're off the list, they're on the list, they're off the list. People fight about that. They're not really arguing about whether they should be on or off the list. What they're fighting about is whether or not they should be hunted.
Right.
And so if you keep them on the list, they can't be hunted. If they come off the list, these states in the West could realistically have hunts, and that pushes buttons for a lot of people to hunt an animal. We don't hunt bald eagles. They were on the list. They're not now, but they were. So that dynamic came into play really early on. And so with the animal itself, what I saw in the field was, ooh, they're smart. They're smart and they don't want to be around us. They just don't. They're not interested in us. They don't want to be around us. They avoid us. I had trail cameras in places that I knew darn well bears were coming through because I was set up for a reason. And those bears would move at night when the people weren't on the trail. They don't have any interest in being around us. What they are interested in is eating. They want to eat. And they want to sleep during the day when it's hot. And then they want to eat some more. And they will eat anything. And they will survive through all these climate changes we're seeing because they can adapt. They eat anything. And you know what that anything includes? That's our garbage. And as humans, the things I saw that shocked me were garbage. You know, there shouldn't be the things laying out. Even sometimes food that I knew was purposely placed there just because people wanted to see a grizzly come. That makes me sick to my stomach. They want to see the bear come out of the trees so they can get a picture. Those bears learn real quickly where they can get easy eats. And we provide easy eats, and that is our mistake. And that is on us to change our behavior. These bears have figured out how to live among us. Now we have to figure out how to live among them because they're here. They're not going away. So if you think about it, the behaviors that I witnessed by both that opened my eyes, both revolved around food, regardless of what you consider food. Grizzlies were looking for food, and sometimes they found it because humans made mistakes.
Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, I think you made a great point is that we need to learn how to live among them because we've decided to live where they live. And yeah, the challenges we face with that kind of a iconic animal is we'll be talking about this for decades. We'll be talking about this for decades. All right. Cognizant of the time, but I don't want to not take a few minutes to talk about your newest project. That's not my not following the same thread, if you will. So talk about sage grouse. You don't pick topics that are not inconsequential in their discussions at the federal level, do you?
It's a good way to say it. Look, if I had wanted my career to be easy, I would have picked something else for my career.
Yeah.
I don't make a lot of money, but I can make a lot of waves, and I do that by bringing you these issues, right? And so Sage Wisdom West is the newest film. I shot it last summer. I changed my whole business model after following salmon migration. And once I pick a topic, I will work out of my truck and camper all summer, following whatever that animal is. I did it for salmon, for grizzlies, and now for sage grouse. Sage grouse are the king of the high desert in the American West. They are the largest grouse in North America, the greater sage grouse. They're about the size of a chicken. And I think the difference with this project is salmon and grizzlies, there's a lot about the landscape in those films. It's remarkable landscapes that these animals live among. But for Sage Wisdom West, I'm trying to show you a landscape that everybody ignores. Grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone, yeah, people are looking at that. The Oregon coast, the Idaho wilderness, yeah, people look at that. Salmon are in there.
Right.
But for Sage Wisdom West, the way I'm going to get you to look at this desert that everyone thinks is the dumpster is by showing you this dynamic bird that struts in the spring, and that's sage grouse. And if their numbers go down, then there's these issues of talking about listing them. If you list a bird like the sage grouse in the West, you're talking about messing with drilling in Wyoming, ranching in Idaho and Montana, recreation across the whole West. It changes things dramatically if that bird like that gets listed. And so where it's not listed now, it was warranted for listing. So it's a bit different as far as urgency. They're not about to be listed, but that's always on the radar because they're warranted for it. And so when that happens, what is it that people have to do? What are they changing to try to keep them off the list? That's kind of the difference with this project. And the big element is there's this huge story in the desert that no one's looking at. And the desert's this fantastic, fantastic landscape that most likely sustains more wildlife than the mountains. But everyone looks to the mountains when they go outside, not the desert. So I want to show you that desert, and I want to show you this bird in the desert.
So Will we hear sounds?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The sound of a sage grouse in the spring is hard to even kind of comprehend what's going on. But the best way I can describe it is the males have these airbags on their chest and they puff them up and they fan their tails out to look fantastic for the ladies. They're just trying to get a date and the ladies don't care. Ladies just kind of strut by and they got to do this dance and show off fancy. And when they puff up their airbags, it sounds like legs rubbing on satin sheets. That's
Uh-huh.
what it sounds like to me. And then as they deflate, it does this pop. And
Hmm.
it sounds like the cork coming out of a champagne bottle. And so those are the sounds that you can hear. And it will start sometimes before there's even daylight. And so in the dark, you're hearing, the rub of the satin sheets and then these champagne corks popping in the dark. And then when it gets light, you realize what those sounds are. And it's these little birds strutting around in the desert. And then when the males will fight, it sounds like a bunch of drums beating. And so
Wow.
there's a lot of sound.
Oh, awesome. Was it harder or easier than doing grizzlies and salmon?
That's a great question. I thought following sage grouse would be easy. Granted,
Right.
they can't kill me like a grizzly can. So, I mean, there's rattlesnakes in the desert,
Right.
but the risk wasn't there like it was with grizzly bears.
Right.
The challenge with salmon is it's all underwater. If you want to see a fish, you got to stick your head under the water.
Yep.
And so I thought that would be hard, but I figured out underwater pretty handily. And finding grizzly bears when I want to see what they're doing without me in the way, that's trail cameras. Those show me a world without me interfering. Sage grouse, I've had trail cameras out, and sage grouse are handing me a huge humble pie. They are so hard to follow, and it comes down to logistics of size. If I can find a grizzly and shoot footage of a grizzly from far away, just like tourists are supposed to,
Right.
I can still see it. Its body is above the sagebrush.
Sure.
That's not the plan with sage grouse. They hide. They are exactly the height that hides them under sagebrush. And they are masters at hiding. And they are masters at running. And they are masters at flying. So even if I finally find some and try to get in on them, they flush and go away and I have nothing. There's a lot of that happens that made sage grouse harder to shoot than I anticipated.
Um, but you were successful.
I have them. Yes, I have them.
You were
And
successful.
there were some very painful, cold mornings and prickly cactus kneecaps and all kinds of other disasters that come with that. But I do have them. I wish I had more of them. But the reality is, in my job, I
Yeah.
always wish I had more
Yeah,
wildlife.
of course. Of course. Of course. A book.
You're putting me on the spot.
All right. Well, I mean,
I'll tell you this.
I love you
Sage-
dearly. You can duck and bob and weave, and I'm not gonna hold
I
you
don't
to
like
it.
when people bob and weave when I'm interviewing them.
Yeah.
Sage Wisdom West was shot over 2024. It is sitting right here on my desk. It's ready
Yep.
to start editing. It will come out in spring 2026. That gives me this year to decide if indeed it warrants a book. There are elements that warrant a book. Are there enough elements to warrant a whole book? I won't know that till I get into the editing stage and I go back to my classic edit film for a few hours, write a few chapters, do that multimedia thing, and then I'll know. The most important thing to me is if I'm going to bring you something new, it better be worth your time. So I better make it stellar. And that's what I'll decide as I'm editing, whether or not it's worthy of a book all the way through.
Well, I'm going to stop there because you have definitely made this episode worth our time. You know, I love you. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. And I'm hoping that we can continue to have conversations about Sage Wisdom West in the future. And anything we can ever do for you, you just let me know. But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this episode of Waterside Chat, share it with your friends and colleagues. You can check us out on YouTube or most podcast services. To stay up to date on Waterside Chats and the Marine Fish Conservation Network, sign up for emails at conservefish.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you at the next Waterside Chat.